They said war couldn't happen at minus 30 degrees, that armies would stop, weapons would fail, and winter itself would draw a line no one could cross. But in late 1950, that belief shattered overnight. What looked like the final act of a short war was actually something far more dangerous. An unstoppable advance pushed deeper into frozen mountains, guided by confidence, speed, and the idea that the fighting was almost over. Warnings were brushed aside. The cold was treated as an inconvenience, and the enemy was assumed to be finished. Then the temperature dropped, and so did the illusion of control. As supply lines stretched, units thinned, and preparation vanished, the environment began to kill faster than bullets. And just beyond the darkness, an unseen force was already moving. How did confidence turn into catastrophe? And how did winter itself become a weapon? To understand what happened next, we have to go back right to the moment victory seemed inevitable. The roots of the disaster at the Chongchon River lay months earlier, after what appeared to be a decisive turning point. In September 1950, the amphibious landing at Incheon shattered North Korean defenses. UN forces rapidly liberated Seoul, while the North Korean People's Army collapsed in retreat. Entire units disintegrated, equipment was abandoned, and prisoners flooded south. To commanders, the campaign seemed virtually won. Strategic resistance appeared broken, and optimism spread through headquarters. The belief took hold that remaining operations were merely a pursuit, not a fight, and that organized enemy resistance in the north was nearing its final collapse. Victory bred urgency. After Seoul was secured, UN leaders debated whether to halt at the 38th parallel or continued north. Political caution warned that crossing risked provoking China or the Soviet Union. Military logic argued that failing to destroy the North Korean army invited renewed war. President Harry Truman ultimately approved the advance, with conditions meant to limit escalation. On paper, the decision appeared balanced. In practice, it prioritized speed over restraint. Once the line was crossed, momentum replaced caution, and every kilometer forward deepened exposure to strategic surprise that commanders would soon fail to recognize until consequences became irreversible. Warnings were present, but they were discounted. Chinese leaders publicly declared they would not tolerate foreign armies near their border. Intelligence reports indicated Chinese formations moving toward the Yalu River. These signals were interpreted as bluffs or defensive posturing. Commanders believed that any intervention would be limited and easily contained by superior firepower and air power. This assumption shaped operational planning. It justified rapid advances, thin deployments, and minimal defensive preparation. The possibility of a large-scale, coordinated Chinese offensive was considered unlikely. Despite accumulating evidence to the contrary from prisoners, patrol contacts, and intelligence summaries arriving daily at headquarters everywhere. As forces advanced, the physical reality of overextension became unavoidable. Units moved hundreds of kilometers across mountainous terrain, often separated by dangerous gaps. Coordination between South Korean and American divisions was uneven, and communications were unreliable. Supply lines stretched along narrow roads, vulnerable to ambush and weather. Fuel, ammunition, and winter clothing lagged behind the front. What looked like relentless pursuit was actually a fragile formation held together by optimism. The farther north troops moved, the more a single shock could unravel the entire line. Without reserves, recovery from surprise depended entirely on luck and improvisation alone under worsening conditions. Morale remained high, reinforcing dangerous assumptions. Soldiers spoke confidently of being home by Christmas, a phrase that reflected institutional belief, not irony. Winter was treated as an inconvenience rather than a decisive factor. Preparations for extreme cold were limited, and the environment was underestimated alongside the enemy. By late November 1950, UN forces stood deep in North Korea, convinced the war was ending. Instead, confidence had stripped away caution. Beneath the frozen silence ahead, an unseen force waited, ready to exploit every mistake at once, made possible by miscalculation, weather, and the illusion of inevitable victory shared across the command. And if you enjoy learning about epic turning points in wars, take a second to support this channel. Leave a like, subscribe, and turn on the bell, because now the story shifts from confidence to catastrophe, and winter is about to strike first. The winter of northern Korea was not a backdrop to the battle. It was an active participant. As November turned into December 1950, temperatures in the Chongchon River Valley dropped below 30°C. Weapons jammed as lubricants froze solid. Truck engines refused to start unless fires were lit beneath them. Fuel thickened into useless sludge. Soldiers slept in shallow foxholes carved from frozen earth, unable to dig deeper. Even the dead could not be buried. The ground was too hard to break. Cold injuries mounted daily, silently eroding combat power before a single shot was fired. The environment was killing men faster than bullets. The cold stripped away technological advantage. Artillery pieces cracked under thermal stress. Radios failed as batteries lost charge within minutes. Medical care became a race against time, as wounds that were survivable in warmer climates turned fatal when blood froze and evacuation routes stalled. Frostbite cases overwhelmed aid stations, and soldiers with minor injuries were often condemned simply because they could no longer march. In these conditions, firepower mattered less than endurance. Nature acted as an invisible weapon, neutralizing superiority through exposure and exhaustion rather than direct confrontation. While UN forces struggled against the cold, a far greater shock was already in motion. In late November, the Chinese People's Volunteer Army launched the second phase campaign. Approximately 230,000 Chinese troops crossed into the fight, moving largely at night, using mountains and forests for concealment. Their approach relied on silence, discipline, and infiltration. Units marched without fires, without radio transmissions, and often without winter clothing, accepting hardship in exchange for surprise. Commanders had not anticipated an offensive of this scale. When it came, it struck suddenly and everywhere at once. The first blow fell on the UN right flank. South Korean units, already stretched thin and poorly supplied, were hit by coordinated Chinese attacks. Entire divisions were encircled and destroyed in rapid succession. The ROK 7th and 8th Infantry Divisions collapsed after being surrounded near Tokshan and Yandong. These losses did more than remove troops from the line. They tore open massive gaps in the front. Chinese forces poured through these openings, bypassing strongpoints and cutting roads, turning a linear advance into a fragmented and vulnerable formation. As the right flank disintegrated, American units were drawn into a fight they could not control. The U.S. 2nd Infantry Division encountered fierce resistance near Kuyi, where Chinese forces attacked repeatedly, often at night, using bugles and whistles to signal assaults. These attacks created confusion and psychological strain, amplified by darkness and cold. Positions that appeared secure by day became untenable by night. The Chinese did not seek immediate annihilation. They sought disruption, isolation, and exhaustion, forcing withdrawals that exposed neighboring units. The collapse accelerated into chaos. Communications between units failed, as radios froze and lines were cut. Orders arrived late or not at all. Retreats began without coordination, with some units pulling back while others remained in place, unaware they were about to be flanked. The Chongchon River Valley became a maze of stalled convoys, abandoned equipment, and disoriented troops moving south under constant pressure. What had been an advance days earlier turned into a race for survival. The most infamous moment of the retreat came at Kun. As UN forces attempted to withdraw through a narrow corridor, Chinese troops blocked the route and poured fire into the column. This stretch became known as the Gauntlet. Vehicles were destroyed, roads clogged with wreckage, and soldiers were forced to abandon the wounded to keep moving. Units lost cohesion entirely. Men marched for days with minimal food, little sleep, and no certainty of where friendly lines were located. Survival depended on movement, not orders. Cold magnified every failure. Wounded soldiers who might have survived evacuation instead froze to death while waiting. Frostbite cases surged as men removed gloves to clear weapons or assist comrades. Many never regained use of their hands or feet. Thousands became casualties without ever encountering the enemy directly. Estimates indicate that nearly half of UN casualties during this phase were caused by exposure rather than combat wounds. The cold did not distinguish between victor and defeated. It punished weakness indiscriminately. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers described the cold as relentless, something that could not be outrun or fought back. Night attacks blurred into hallucinations, as exhaustion and hypothermia eroded judgment. Discipline weakened, not through cowardice, but through physical limits. Even experienced units struggled to maintain formation. In this environment, leadership became reactive rather than directive, focused on extraction rather than maneuver. The battlefield no longer followed plans. It followed temperature, terrain, and endurance. By early December, the 8th Army was in full retreat toward the 38th parallel. What began as a confident offensive had unraveled into the largest withdrawal of the war. The Chinese advance succeeded not only because of numbers or tactics, but because winter amplified every mistake made during the advance north. Overextension, ignored intelligence, and logistical fragility became fatal once combined with extreme cold. Technology failed. Coordination collapsed. Nature completed what strategy began. The Battle of the Chongchon River revealed a brutal truth. Modern armies do not fight only their enemies. They fight terrain, weather, and time. In northern Korea, winter erased the illusion that war could be paused or postponed by climate. It proved that code could be as decisive as any weapon system, turning confidence into catastrophe. The battle was not just lost to the Chinese offensive, it was lost to the belief that nature could be ignored. And in that frozen valley, the environment became the most unforgiving force on the battlefield. The retreat that followed the Battle of the Chongchon River was the largest of the Korean War. The 8th Army fell back in stages, abandoning hard-won ground and withdrawing toward the 38th parallel. What had begun as an offensive meant to end the conflict instead erased any illusion of a quick victory. The idea of being home by Christmas vanished in the snow, replaced by the reality of survival under constant pressure. The war had not ended in northern Korea. It had fundamentally changed. Strategically, the battle marked a decisive shift. Chinese intervention was no longer theoretical or limited. It was massive, coordinated, and effective. The UN advance collapsed, and the conflict settled into a prolonged stalemate that would define the remainder of the war. From this point forward, neither side would achieve decisive victory. The Chongchon River became the moment when momentum reversed and the Korean War transformed, from a war of movement into a war of endurance. The lessons were harsh and enduring. Commanders had underestimated the terrain, the climate, and the enemy simultaneously, a fatal combination. Intelligence warnings were discounted, supply lines overstretched, and coordination fractured. Most critically, the environment was treated as a secondary concern rather than an active factor. To battle, Ming showed that weather does not merely complicate operations, it shapes outcomes. Cold erased technological advantages, punished logistical weakness, and magnified every strategic mistake made earlier in the campaign. In retrospect, the winter of 1950 stands as a reminder that war does not pause for human expectations. The belief that large-scale combat was impossible at Train to Sea proved dangerously wrong. The battle happened anyway, and it was deadlier because of the cold. Nature did not prevent the fighting. It intensified it. Frostbite claimed lives alongside bullets, and exposure destroyed units as effectively as in the Battle of the Chongchon River was the war that should not have happened, yet did. It revealed that climate can be as decisive as strategy, and that ignoring it invites disaster. In that frozen valley, winter became the ultimate antagonist. The war continued, but the lesson endured. When nature enters the battlefield, it does not negotiate. It only punishes.